Okay, here we go. I'd love for us to just introduce ourselves really quickly because some of you might be new to this one and didn't get to meet us in the previous weeks. So, Robert, could we start with you? Can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you specialize in?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Robert Vore. As you mentioned, I'm an APC, so I'm a therapist, obviously here. I specialize primarily with adolescents and young adults, so kind of 12 to 30 age range, things like anxiety, suicidality, life transitions, social things, stuff like that.
Awesome. How about you, Victoria?
Yeah, I'm Victoria Hicks, and I'm a LPC and AMFT, soon to be fully LMFT, like she mentioned. And I work a lot with clients with anxiety, and I work with a lot of couples. So I do emotionally focused therapy with them, and I also work with missionaries, and a lot of those things, and things like communication, relationship issues, grief, spirituality issues, a lot of that with my clients.
Awesome. Thanks so much. How about you, Catherine? Can you share with us who you are, where you're located, and what you do? Oh, you're muted.
Have to be the first one to break the ice that way. I'm Catherine Kessler. I'm the Lawrenceville site director, and I'm an LMSW. I've worked for many years in grief and loss, but currently mostly working with women 18 or older in the areas of anxiety, life transitions, grief, loss, and spirituality. It's a bit about me.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here. How about you, Frank?
Yeah, my name's Frank Collins. I'm an associate licensed marriage and family therapist. I work at the Lawrenceville location as well. I work with families and couples, adolescents and adults. I kind of fit everybody in, but a lot of my work is relational. So in relationship to each other and families, and then also like spiritual relationship, kind of spiritual direction work as well.
Love that. Okay, and last but certainly not least, Miss Sylvia Collins, will you share who you are and what you do?
Yes, absolutely. I'm Sylvia Collins. I'm in the process of finalizing my associate license as a clinical mental health counselor. I love to do work with people who have mood and anxiety disorders, who are processing through a life transition, have some maybe trauma or family of origin dynamics they want to process, codependency, boundary work. And I also work with adolescents and adults, mostly with the adult population. Yeah, that's me.
That's awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here. This is going to be such a valuable conversation. Guys, this is us. This is Cumberland Counseling. We have two locations where you can meet in person with these therapists. We have a Smyrna location where myself, Robert, and Victoria can meet you in person or virtually. And then we have the Lawrenceville location inside, I should say, Gate City Church. And that's where Catherine, Frank, and Sylvia can meet with you in person and virtually as well. If this is the first time that you're joining us and you would like to get started in therapy, visit our website, cumberlandcenters.org. And the very first thing you'll see is a button that says make an appointment. That'll let us know that you're ready to get started, and we'll get you connected with one of these incredible people right away. And they really are incredible. I can't tell you how many awesome reviews I get like on the back end that people just want to let me know they've had such a great experience. So if you're ready, please reach out and we'll get you started. All right, why don't we dive in? Okay, so this topic matters so much to us as parents, to I think us as a society. My gosh, this is a really big topic. And our resident adolescent therapist, I don't know why I keep referring to you as that, but you really work so well with, you're right, that 12 to 30 age range. They really connect with you and you do great work with them. Can you just share with us off the top of your head your thoughts on social media and your thoughts on the phone, anything like that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, right, is it's so easy to come into these types of conversations from kind of the assumption of social media is bad, phones are bad, right? Like that kind of vibe, which I definitely understand. As new things develop, it's easy to kind of them to shock us a little bit. I think what I was hoping to do in kind of setting the framework for the conversation is to say, I think we can have a more nuanced conversation, and I actually think that's really important, right? If I were to say, hey Alex, what's the impact of eating food on teenagers? Right, you would say that's a wild question. What we need to talk about is what types of food, how often, are we doing things in moderation? How does that make you feel? That's different for everybody, right? And so I think we can have that type of a kind of nuanced conversation in terms of, okay, how are we using technology? How are we using different social medias, different things like that? And to talk about it in terms of like, what are the positives, what are the benefits, what are the negatives, right? Like all those types of things. And so to kind of set the framework in that way, as opposed to kind of coming purely from like this is bad, what do we do kind of stance.
I love that. Yeah, it's funny because when this topic opens up, it usually does open up in the negative. In fact, we as a group were coming up with some questions, and all the questions we put together kind of had that like negative spin on social media. And it was actually Robert who came back and said, I don't think we should set it up so that it's so negative. It should probably be a little bit more. For example, what are the pros and cons of being able to connect through social media and having this much access to media? What do you guys think? What are some pros to having this much connection?
I personally, I feel like if we were having this conversation even 2 years ago, could have potentially looked a lot different. But I think our experience through the last year with COVID has really highlighted, I think, a lot of the benefits of social media and just technology in our phones. Just seeing how, even personally, being able to attend or have people attend my wedding virtually, or small groups and groups of friends to stay connected on social media in a way that we wouldn't have been able to if it weren't an option. Even attending family gatherings or funerals. I just feel like there were a lot of great opportunities for connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I completely agree with everything Catherine shared, and even my work with teens, seeing how important for them during the pandemic it was to get to connect with friends. And I think that there's kind of two ways that social media can be used. I think it can be, scrolling with thousands of these loose connections that don't feel very meaningful. And I think there can be the messaging, the pictures, the fun with the inner circle of friends. And I think that can bring people a lot of joy, sending each other funny things. I think that can go a long way. And we know that obviously there is a quick, immediate dopamine hit to the brain when we're on these very high reward platforms, and we have to be mindful of like time limits and how we're using it. But even to throw in another con, I've worked with some teens with nonverbal learning disabilities, and so similar with them, and ones maybe who may have an autism spectrum diagnosis, it can be a great way to connect without that barrier of the anxiety of what if I miss the nonverbal cues. How I just think it can be, there's more benefit in certain ways that we don't always think about, because we are hearing a lot of the important caution to it as well. So I just wanted to add that in, that when used appropriately, I think it really can be helpful. And we've got to continue to work on those low dopamine activities to counteract, if we're doing an hour on the social media, hour reading a book, doing a hobby, so that the brain gets that more delayed gratification as well, to kind of create that balance.
I love that. That was such a good tip. I don't know for any of you guys, but I noticed that if I spend a lot of time on social media or days in a row where I'm focusing on something that I'm doing on social media, it is a little bit harder to stay alone with my own thoughts. It's a little bit harder to go slower, because for a little while I was so used to that, major dopamine hit. So I love that. Any other thoughts on that from you guys? The high dopamine versus the low dopamine hit. I'm interested in hearing more.
I was just thinking from a connection standpoint, like you guys have mentioned. I think similarly, and when it comes to expectations, it's like social media, media in general, it's a tool and it can be used positively or negatively. And just its existence is neutral. And I think similar to how parents create boundaries around how like their kids can stay up with friends and which friends they can be around and like what movies they can watch and what things they can buy at the store. I think we also, it's like a whole nother frontier of existence that parents have to navigate now. And it can be really intimidating and confusing because there's so many apps and so much information, and the kids typically know more about that than the parents do. And information is constantly evolving. And I just think the amount of information that you want your child to have access to is really something to take into consideration. So there are issues and things to see and think about that you wouldn't want like a second grader to be thinking about and seeing versus like a sixth grader or a 12th grader or even a young college student. And so I think really kind of thinking about it in terms of the platform isn't necessarily the issue, but we have to just kind of create a new virtual world of boundaries and parenting in that environment, which is really challenging. It comes up a lot with work with adolescents and their parents. A lot of parents come in and they want to get rid of their kid's phone. That's like the first thing they want to do. And there's so many options and alternatives kind of in between that we try to work on to create some balance there.
I think the cool thing too about like helping teach kids how to have boundaries with your phone is you're not only teaching them that with social media, but you're teaching them how to do that in things in the future, like school or even relationships or even in future work environments. And they can learn how to do something in moderation because anything in excess can be unhealthy. So then we can apply that to the future. You're teaching them something valuable that they can take with them for the rest of their life, even when you're not around. Absolutely. That relates to me for what we were sharing too, of having that balance of, okay, if I'm going to spend this much time on social media, that's fine. I can choose to do that. And I need to also be thinking of what else am I going to spend my time doing? And I think with teens, a lot of this can be a dialogue instead of the parents saying, this is what you're going to do, but really helping to create a culture of honor where you get to discuss those things and come to those decisions together. And the one thing that is really interesting with digital use is that if you start to set a boundary, so for instance with gaming, for 1 hour, which gaming is another big social platform that a lot of teens are using these days, and it can be a great outlet. The problem is when you're gaming for hours and hours on end, your brain just it's like your dopamine receptors start to decrease because of the excess of dopamine. And then you get to where you're only playing to not feel bad anymore. You're not playing to feel good. And so it's saying, okay, you can play for an hour. And if you hold that boundary consistently, the teen's body clock will actually they'll start to realize, oh, I think I'm getting close to that hour being up, instead of that power struggle, push the boundary every single time. And let it be a dialogue of how can we partner together and create a plan that everyone feels respected and that we're not going to budge on. And that can be more challenging with phones because obviously there's texting and how do you create those boundaries? But I think just having dialogue can be so empowering.
I definitely agree with that. That's what I was going to bring up, is like that conversation, right? And as Victoria mentioned, teaching a skill to move into the future, right? Because if I just say, okay, you only have 1 hour of screen time or whatever, which for the record, we should throw the term screen time out entirely, because that means nothing. You do school online, you do TV, you watch, there's a million things. So that as a catch-all term is not super helpful. But if you just say, okay, you have 1 hour of screen time, it becomes that kind of push-pull, right? But if we can have a conversation about, hey, what were you doing during that time period? How did you feel afterwards? Things like that. Then we can, I learn more about you and what you're doing online and the things that impact you. But I can also help you as the adolescent or even a younger child, right? Start to gain some of that insight of, oh, it's worth checking in. I spent an hour on social media. Was I mindlessly kind of scrolling and then I felt bad afterwards, or was I like engaging with my friends and building those relationships and I felt better afterwards, right? Like using those conversations to build that connection, but then also to help like the individual kind of evaluate and gain some of that insight.
Yeah, and even thinking what you shared, Robert, maybe think of like, what kind of family activities are you participating in? Are people, you sit in the living room, everyone's on their phone, or are you like playing games and engaging in dialogue or going on walks and being in nature? It is a muscle that you have to stretch if you're not used to that delayed gratification. Like what Alex shared, I relate to a ton of, I'll have days where I'm just kind of on my phone a ton, and then I'm like, oh, I don't feel as connected to my heart. I don't feel like myself. And then when I do go on that walk or that hike that I normally love, I'm a little antsy. I'm not as present. And so it does take practice to build that muscle of actually being alone with yourself and then being connected with others, because once you're used to getting that hit all the time, your brain wants to keep being entertained. And that's why even just doing those low dopamine activities, I have to consciously think about them, like, okay, I'm reading books now before bed, and I'm going on a walk once a day if I can, which can go a long way. So having some family activity even that might bring in some of those opportunities, I think can be really helpful to teach that patience piece, that delayed gratification piece, instead of just putting the burden all on the child to create boundaries over something that can be that highly addictive. I don't think any of us could do that well as a developing human.
I think it also starts like when the kids are as old enough that they can pick up the phone and start, because used to babysit, and I've had kids that were like 2 or 3 would be picking up my phone and knowing what to do. I'm like, how did you learn that? Right. So it starts that young too, like watching what are the boundaries and what's the moderation look like, and teaching them that sometimes they can't have some things. They're going to have to learn that this is what's okay and what's not okay, and experience the conflict of that a little bit too. Yeah, I'll add that I babysit a lot, or did throughout my graduate program. And I would sometimes find myself like, the kids are seeing me looking at my phone the whole time. If I'm like waiting for texts from the parents, or just they're busy engaging in something, so I'm checking my email. And anytime they need my attention, I realized like, wow, they're having to like break my attention from my phone. So even that was a wake up call of, what am I modeling, even for these children that aren't my own? But I think it's important to think about. So I think, thanks for bringing that up, Victoria. It's convicting for me too, because I'm like, man, it's what I'm showing too.
Absolutely. The do as I say, not as I do thing is completely, it's debunked. I don't know if that's the right way of putting that, but that is not a thing. Do as I say, not as I do. That's more of a fear-based or control-based parenting technique. We as children, we absolutely learn from what we see our parents do. Whatever they say to us, we're going to pick up little bits here and there, but generational, trauma, if you will, generational hardships come through what we see mostly. So, and I think I've got a 2.5-year-old. I think about that all the time. If he's, I was with him a couple of days ago this week, home sick. And if I'm sitting on the couch with him while he's sick and cuddling with me, and I'm answering emails on my phone, or on social media or whatever I'm doing, probably for work and for, my own satisfaction as well, he's watching all of that. And there have absolutely been moments where he'll turn around and see me do that. And then I notice that he sort of detaches a little bit, and he wants more of a connection with me, and he doesn't see it in that moment. I have to almost like say, wait, baby, I'll be right there. And that is not a good feeling. So he's seeing that. And that's how our children really are learning from us. They're not really learning from what we say all the time. They're learning mostly from what we do, what we model.
I think on a similar point to that is there's the creating boundaries of what we're not going to do, like when the time on video games ends, like, and kind of showing that parents, like building that culture of like, we put our phones down when we're all together as a family. But also I think part of the work is not just setting what's off limits, but introducing what is for the current time. And I think a lot of times we create rules around things that are bad, but we forget to fill our time with things that are fulfilling. And I think that's part of that burden is on parents. It's an invitation to create a culture within your family and with your kids, and like helping develop their creativity. And so a little effort goes a long way. sometimes sometimes kids are just really bored, and that's why they gravitate toward what's easy and accessible, which is typically always going to be electronics, because there's so much stimulus. It's so interesting. It's always available, but it takes a little bit more effort to like paint or to like set up a time to play with the kids who actually live across the street, and a little bit of parent effort can go a really long way in doing that. And so if you're experiencing pushback as a parent around some of these boundaries, sometimes it can be helpful to create a new opportunity to invite your kid into, to kind of get them on board, to cast a vision for them that they can believe in, and one that is attainable. So if you get out the supplies, if you invite the other friends over, if you engage them in a new activity, listen to music together, make dinner fun instead of just the routine, the kids are going to be a lot more likely to kind of buy in and really start to use that. That will become their culture as well.
I love that. And even before you said the word bored, I had jotted it down because I wanted to bring that point up, that a lot of times we run from boredom because we do have the opportunity to get so stimulated so quickly. And boredom is like the birthplace of creativity. And I think what Frank shared is really important, that parents can kind of springboard that for children, and just even saying like, all right, from this time to this time is outside time every day. And kids may be like, what am I going to do? But if you let them sit in that for long enough, they come up with things to do. And that's where that I just think that they can come alive a little bit, and actually having this space to be bored. Because if you don't, you don't really have that ingenuity and those ideas spark up. So I just want to throw that out there too. I'm having to work on that for myself, of how do I let myself be bored and sit still when I want to just watch a show or go find something fun to eat, or adventure in a million different ways, and to actually just sit there. And then think, I think I'll go sew something. It can be whatever it is for that person. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I feel like something that you all have already touched on is just being more mindful with social media. So even before opening up the app or the program, like, why am I, asking ourselves, why am I going to social media right now? Am I bored? Am I looking to connect? And, what's the purpose behind it? And then again, as y'all have touched on, how is this making me feel? And just having a more mindful approach to engaging in it, and seeing, sometimes it could be really helpful and connecting, and then other times it's not as beneficial. And I think teaching that to children as well, and having those conversations around it, and just asking and checking in with them, with their experience with social media. Is it bringing up jealousy? Is it because they're bored? Or they, what kind of emotions are being evoked from their engagement on it?
I had a similar conversation with my husband a few months ago, where I revealed to him, I think I recognized that it was probably in COVID when there was a lot more, social media time, which was excellent in so ways. And for me, I said, I think I'm going to social media when I feel anxious, because I want to drink in social media, or I want to consume something so that I don't have to feel those feelings. And I would notice that anytime when I became mindful of it, I would notice anytime those feelings came up, my hand would immediately go to my phone, and the feeling would come up again. I would, distract myself. It would come up again. I would immediately pick up my phone. So I love what you were saying, Sylvia, just teaching the skill, and it starts with you. You have to become aware. You have to practice it first. One thing we as therapists say is you can only go as deep with someone as you've been willing to go with yourself. The same is true with your kids. If you're noticing an issue with your kids, take a moment and reflect with yourself. See if that's an issue with you as well. Practice allowing yourself to feel your own feelings. Become aware of what your feelings are in a given moment. I know Robert, all of us talk about this. Robert has an idea for, wanting to have like a feelings wheel on your keychain or something, so it's like accessible all the time. That's a great start, truly, is to put a feelings wheel, laminated if you can, all over your house. Have one in your kid's bedroom, have one in your bedroom, have one in the kitchen, in the living room, so that you guys can practice in a moment going to a list of feelings to develop a feelings vocabulary and asking, what is it that you're feeling right now if you're feeling drawn to social media or drawn to your phone over and over and over again? And you might find that there's actually something you need to spend a little bit of time with. And then once you've spent a little bit of time with it, then go back and truly connect or truly explore or truly research whatever it is. But parents, it really does start with you having that insight with yourself to be able to teach that to your kids.
Yeah, and I think one of the important aspects of this is shifting from like the tendency towards judgment to like curiosity, right? So right there, you could have said, "Oh, I'm on my phone too much. That's so terrible," which wouldn't probably have helped. It would have made you feel worse, right? So you say, okay, interesting, what's happening here, right? And using that same kind of posture towards our kids, right? Instead of like, oh, you're always on your phone, get off that, right? Hey, what are you doing on there? What, are you interacting with friends? Are you using it for connection? Because that's a positive thing. Are you, things like that, which accounts for some like recognition of this is hard for all of us, right? Like I'm 30 and when I'm bored, I immediately open Twitter, right? Like if I move the icon on my phone, I accidentally like by default open whatever went in its place, right? And that's like, oh, yikes, And so if it's hard for us, right, like as an adult, like you're bored, you turn on the TV out of default, right? Then of course it's hard for developing brains for people that have grown up with this, right? They were born into this. Most of us here, like, in middle school, we all got phones or whatever, right? Like now there's 2 or 3-year-olds, right? My son is 3. He knows how to operate a tablet, right? Like that's wild. But so of course that's difficult. And so can we respond with curiosity and compassion, both towards ourselves, but also like to the people we're parenting?
It's important to mention too that just we are such social beings and we are meant to connect. And this last year, I think just to name, a lot of people have probably felt to some degree loneliness, and maybe in a way that they hadn't recognized was loneliness, because we are still getting this connection. We're on Zoom, yet are we having meaningful conversations? Are we sharing vulnerably how we're doing, how we're feeling? And it can be hard when we know the rest of the world is going through similar things and everyone's got their own stuff going on. And even just helping, I think, ourselves, our teens, our kids name like, oh, I think you might be feeling lonely, if that's going on, and recognizing that you can have a shallow form of connection that's not really going to fill the cup. And that can happen kind of loosely with social media. And again, we've named the benefits and how that connection can be vital, and just recognizing, wow, I think I need, to have a spur night party with a friend if I can, or if it's safe, or to see someone or meet up for coffee, and to just name that it's normal for people to feel lonely in this last year that has been a pandemic, and to name that, especially when it might not seem as stark obvious as lonely before pandemic would have seemed like.
Yeah, very good. This was a great discussion. I know there's so much more that we could talk about. In fact, I really, social media is so good in so many ways. People really do connect around the world, around the country, even just with people kind of in their hometown or in the next town over. For example, Robert Vore up there, you see that he has this like fancy microphone. He has this fancy microphone because a lot of his time is spent hosting a podcast called CXMH Podcast. It's fantastic. It stands for Church Intersecting with Mental Health. Check it out if you want to. I was starting this counseling program a couple of years ago, and was starting to lead some classes and just diving into as much education as I could on the topic of blending faith with mental health. I didn't grow up as a Christian, so that was still new for me, how to blend these two things. I started listening to podcasts, reading articles, things like that, and I stumbled upon his. I listened to several of them. I mean, maybe even all that he had at that time, took notes, even like on one of my PowerPoint slides had his quote on a slide. I hadn't even met him yet. And then I, being kind of the, person with gumption maybe that I have just decided to reach out and say, hey, I heard, and this is so creepy, but I heard that you live in Decatur, I'm in Smyrna, we're doing the same thing, would you like to get coffee and see if maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel together, we can maybe collaborate. We got coffee, and now he's leading or helping to lead the discussion on social media, so guys, there is so much beauty that can come with this much easy access to connection. We can actually see that the world is a much smaller place, and the world is actually not quite as scary in some sense, because all you really have to do is send a message or reach out, and chances are at some point you might be able to connect with that person, which is what Robert and I were able to do. Robert, anything on that topic specifically? Because I know you're in the social media world, with your podcast and everything. Any last thoughts on the beauty, really, of this much connection?
Yeah, I think, keeping in mind that we are social beings, right? Like, we're created for connection. And again, just really evaluating, hey, am I using these tools, right, as Frank said, to foster that connection, right? Like, you are one, but I've made a bunch of really, really good friends through social media. There's obviously limitations to that in terms of you gotta make sure that the people are safe and things like that, right? Obviously, we want to be having all those conversations, but we want to have both sides of that. We know that social media, there's some evidence that like it leads to an increase in empathy, right? Like, because I can hear a bunch of people's stories that I wouldn't have ever heard in my like actual existence bubble, right? Things like that. And so, having both sides of that conversation present, I think is important, and that's obviously what we've been trying to do here today.
Well, I know for the listeners out there, I know you guys are going to have questions. As soon as Robert said, you want to make sure that they're safe, my little parental fire went off like, holy smokes, absolutely. And I knew that Robert was safe. And yes, that's probably going to bring up some thoughts and some questions about stranger danger and how easy it is, to connect with people who might not be safe. I'm sure that's a thought as well. But there's so much social media bashing that goes on, especially for parents of teens in this generation. And so I love that where our conversation went was a little less negative and scary and take the phones away and get rid of it, it's going to destroy you, and a little bit more, guys, this is a tool. Just like, eating a healthy, balanced diet, that's a tool to be healthier and to be successful in life. This is just a tool. The ripping the phone out of the hand is probably not going to bring success, but having open, collaborative communication, getting a little bit more intentional about feeling your own emotions and plugging in with what's going on with yourself so that you can teach that to your kids. That's where we're heading. And that's where the start of what good, healthy boundaries with social media and the phone, that's the beginning of that conversation for you and your partner and your family. So any last thoughts on boundaries or anything like that? And then we'll close up and get ready just to accept your questions if you guys have any.
The only encouragement I would give just around parents setting boundaries, if both parents are still in the home, just communicating clearly beforehand before communicating those boundaries to your kids. That will really help you guys be on the same page. You'll both be able to reinforce. The kid won't have conflicting messages. There won't be any undermining. It'll all be clear. Even though it takes extra work, to talk to your spouse, it'll all be so clear for each other, but also for your children. And that just develops a culture of respect and accountability, which is sustainable. Because ideally, all the rules and boundaries that you have with your children, they're not going to wear you out, And so I think that's just something that kind of popped in my mind as you think about boundaries around electronics and gaming and social media.
Awesome. All right, well, let's end here. Listeners, we're ready for you. So get your questions ready and we can have a little bit more of a chat. You'll notice that all of us are not in the chat. This was a pre-recording. Obviously, not everybody could be here tonight. But those of us who are here, we would love to answer your questions and keep the dialogue going. Remember, guys, next week is our last one. I know June has 5 weeks. We're only actually doing this for 4 weeks. Next week is our last one, and it's going to be on healthy sexuality and, gosh, the topic of easy access pornography. That's actually led by me. I got voted off the island, I think, and had to take that one. And I love that I did because it was, I think, a good discussion. So come back next week, be here for that. If you were not here for the first 2 conversations, let us know and we'll make sure you have access to those. Thank you, counselors, for being here. Thanks for all the work that you do. Yeah, let's keep the discussion going.
All right, guys. My computer did not want me to get out of that mode. All right. So let's dive in. I mean, I think that was a really interesting question, but discussion, but I'm sure you guys have some questions or comments or anything. I want to start with Miss Private Questions up there. Catherine, did you get any confidential questions during that time? Okay.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. No, I don't have any questions.
Okay, good.
I have a comment. I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the just being mindful. And that's so easy. Well, it's so simple, but sometimes it's difficult to do because you don't want to, because you're running to your phone because you want to escape or for whatever reason. But just having that in my brain at the forefront is going to almost force me to be mindful of, why am I picking my phone up? What am I feeling right now? Am I doing that to escape or avoid doing something I don't want to do that I need to do? I loved that. So I really appreciate that. And I also loved I wrote down, boredom is the birthplace of creativity. I wrote that down. I like that. I do have a question here. Can any of us suggest a program that blocks mature content for children?
I think it would depend on what platform you're talking about, whether it's like a web browser or like within Instagram or things like that, to get really specific suggestions.
To the person who asked that question, do you have a specific platform that you're referring to? And you're welcome to even just put it in the chat, or you can speak directly. Maybe we can find something for you for that one specifically. Oh, for YouTube. Okay. Counselors, any thoughts? Have you heard of any that block mature content on YouTube?
Unfortunately, with YouTube, even with parental controls and things in place, sometimes the monitor rate isn't very quick and things leak through. So it's a tricky platform because there often ends up being things on there anyway. And I think with YouTube, yeah, I was just going to say that. I think there are ways through YouTube you can work through them. I haven't used them myself or had clients use them, so I don't know how effective they are. So I'll let anyone else has any thoughts on that one. Feel free to chime in.
A lot of times their parents kind of have to get creative from what I've seen, depending on the different apps their children are using. So certain filters, depending on what kind of content you're trying to block, like certain apps you're able to put parental filters through the app. So that's something to look at specifically with YouTube. And then if you're there on an iPhone, maybe you could lock the app controls like through the screen time or those filters. And then if they're on a desktop or PC computer, you could use Circle, which is a family program that kind of is able to filter through your Wi-Fi system. So it uses all the devices online. Or you could use a site like Covenant Eyes, which filters for inappropriate content. And then it also takes screenshots of what the child might be looking at if it triggers it as being inappropriate. So what some parents will do is they'll delete the YouTube app and then lock the settings, and then they'll make the child sign into YouTube through the internet browser, which is through a filter. So I know that's a lot of steps to take, but that's one of the ways some parents kind of navigate that one.
To the person who asked that question, was that a good answer, or is there anything more that you were looking for that? Very good. Thanks, you guys. That's what I was thinking too. Yeah, that was a great answer. And I wrote that down I could even maybe email you just apps that block mature content on YouTube. It sounds like that was pretty well answered, but we'll see if there's anything more that we can find. And then we did have one other question in the chat. It wasn't a private question, just right in the chat if you guys had a chance to read that. He wrote, how do you best support your kids that have restrictions on their phones, but they encounter teasing because of having restrictions on their phones? And these are high school aged kids. That's a great question. What are your thoughts?
I always like to frame boundaries that other families might not hold as almost like a place of integrity, like you're calling them higher into maturity. So I think their friends and peers might tease them because they think it's immature or they think it's childish. But really, if you frame it for your children as we are building like integrity in our home, and we want the person that we are on the outside in front of people to be the same person that we are behind closed doors on our devices. And even when parents model it and be like, we also like have this accountability in our family, like our spouses see each other's phones, like there's really no reason for us to have access to that content, and just kind of creating a culture in your family that's just like really empowers that, instead of kind of feeding into the narrative that like, you're missing out or it's less than, just really being like, there's really nothing you're missing out on. Like, this is just going to help us become the kind of people that we want to be, and kind of framing it in a different way. And that can, I think, sometimes disempower some of the, maybe bullying or comments that might be made to a teenager.
That was great, Frank. Any other thoughts on that? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, Robert, but I'm wondering if you were to, I think you probably knew this was coming, but if you were to have a client sit with you, a teenage client sit with you, and this is something that they're struggling with, what do you think might be the first, one or two avenues you might walk down with them, with the teens specifically, on kind of how to navigate that with them personally?
Yeah, I think I think I would treat it much the same as essentially any other teasing, right? Like every kid gets teased, and I don't mean that in like a dismissive way, but like that's a reality of it. And so we're going to have to learn how to support our kids through that, regardless of whether it's the, even if you took all the whatever's off, the restrictions or whatever, even if you took all those off, there's something, right? So not making it like its own weird special thing, but like, how do we support our kids when they're encountering teasing regardless, right? And thinking through, ways that they could handle that situation, right? Like what's important to them, hearing their side of it, right? Not like, oh, those kids don't know what they're talking about, don't worry about it, right? They are worried about it. That's painful and it hurts. And within the ecosystem of high school, being bullied does matter, right? So trying not to like downplay the experience of it, which I think is really easy for us to do. Like, who cares what they think? they do, your kid does, right? Like they do, and so does everybody else, because that's how high school works, right? Or middle school or whatever. And so like listening to that and validating that, and then, okay, can we kind of think through like, hey, within the context, what are some ways that we could deal with that or thing, but while recognizing that like they're the expert on, so if you say, oh, just don't hang out with those kids, and they say that won't work, okay, they know what will work and what won't, right? Like they go to school every day and see those kids. And so like working with them. And I mean, in this instance, really easily, you could say like, just blame it on me. That's cool. Like, just throw mom and dad under the bus, right? I mean, I don't know. That's pretty, like, Alex, you've said that before, right? Like, if people are mad about whatever, just tell them it's your boss's fault, right? Like, that would be a really easy one. Maybe you don't love that one, but but I would say like the collaborative aspect, right? Like that does hurt their feelings. That does matter within the system of high school. And so how can we navigate that?
Excellent. Yeah. What I took from that, because that's exactly why I wanted to ask you, Robert, because I'm sure that you've probably sat across from someone who has been bullied. And yes, the kind of the go-to advice is, well, it matters what you think about you, not what others think about you. That's what my mom told me my entire life. And that was such great advice. And I remember that to this day. But I think more than anything, what I needed in that moment as a kid was to hear her validate that what I was experiencing really was painful, to be bullied, to be made fun of. And then going back to Frank's advice, validating the feeling, and then going back to, and here's why we do this. And this is going to be hard for a little while longer, and it won't be like this forever. And you can throw me under the bus always. This is your dad's fault, not yours. So we got from the asker of the question, we got a little great advice, but I do want to come back to you, Leon. Did that answer your question, or is there anything more that we could speak to? Because I know that's a big one. Well, what about for the rest of you guys? Did any other thoughts come up, or did you hear anything and it made you want to ask a different kind of question or lean into something? Yeah, go ahead.
We have a private question.
Okay.
What do you consider a healthy amount of time on social media or video games?
Did y'all hear that? No, okay. I don't know if it was just my internet or maybe Catherine's, but Catherine, could you read that again, please?
Yeah, sorry, I might have cut out. What do you consider a healthy amount of time on social media and video games?
So I think pointing back to like in the video when we talked about like the goal of having the conversation in terms of how different things impact you, how you're using those tools, things like that, right? There's some evidence that like kind of just mindless scrolling type stuff, which we all do, right? But like that leads, or that is like more strongly correlated with like negative outcomes, and like using social media actively to like interact with people leads to potentially more positive outcomes, right? So I would, there is obviously a limit somewhere maybe, right? But I think instead of like a hard and fast, like, oh, it's this exact amount of time, I think, obviously for each individual, it's different depending on what you do, depending on how sensitive you are, depending on how you're using those, right? So maybe for me, and this is something that I like work with myself pretty often to try and like, I think maybe I'm not getting anything out of social media right now. And so maybe I need to be mindful of that, right? But like, okay, what if I spend 1 hour on this platform interacting with people? Is that different than 2 hours where I'm just kind of like, things are kind of going past my eyes and I'm not actually interacting or building connections. And so then there's a lot of comparison, right? Like, but having those types of conversations, which involves which requires you to be able to do that somewhat as well, right? And I think we alluded to that, but like that's hard work for me to evaluate as a 30-year-old to say, my thing told me I was on Twitter for 17 hours this week. What did I get out of that? If it was connection building, great. If I learned a bunch of stuff, great. If not, okay, maybe not. And my ability to do that as a 30-year-old is like requires a lot of intention. So if it's, a teenager or even like a early 20s, like I probably need to help ask a lot of those questions, because your ability to just like poof, do that is probably less than mine is, which is still not super great, to be honest, right? So
I love that. I love the idea of, rather than just giving a hard and fast rule, like the question was, let's see. Oh, it was a private question. So the question was, how long do you think is a good rule of thumb, basically, for how long you should be on social media? And I love that Robert's answer was, it kind of depends on what you're doing on it. And it kind of depends on what the app is, right? So rather than giving a hard and fast rule, you will only be on social media for 2 hours a day. Anything more than that, I'm taking your phone away, right? That's kind of how we tend to want to handle those things, because we like boundaries are good and it's a little bit easier to be black and white like that. But to Robert's point, it's going to require a little bit more of a conversation and a little bit more of a check-in with yourself first. Well, what am I getting out of a more interactive experience on social media? Could it help with, am I actually, playing with my friends? Do I need to be playing with my friends? Am I, is this helping with school? Am I researching, whatever, versus scrolling? So it would require a conversation with your child, where you can maybe even get their input before, and then you guys could maybe write down something together rather than just telling them that they only have 2 hours on the phone. I like that. Everything just kind of comes back to, you got to check in with yourself first, and you really need to validate and collaborate before you just start, spitting out rules.
Yeah, and to answer the question too about video games, I know that might be a little more nuanced, is what is going to be the most, what kind of time frame will actually allow for balance? So, what else does the child, teen, adult have going on? How many hours of free time are there? So if like there's only a few hours of free time as it is, and all of that is being spent on video games, then that might not be serving them best. And obviously there are video games on the phone as well. And some kids may say, well, I want to play live with my friends. You may say, okay, you've got an hour from this time to this time. They're like, well, my friends are going to be on from this time to this time. And so kind of being flexible and like talking them through that. And still, I think you can come up with a consistent time that best serves them, best serves the family system. Say that's an hour, a day, or for some people, maybe an hour a week or a few hours a week on one day, whatever that looks like. I think it is hard to answer that pointedly. And it really just depends on what will enable them to use that time and then go do that low dopamine activity as well, so that they're not just engrossed in that and during all their free time.
Yeah, and a question that came in kind of piggybacking off that last one, and setting boundaries. What do you do, or how do you deal with a teen who's very combative with boundaries that you try to set on social media and gaming?
Go back last week and listen. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, that's in adolescence, right? You're like bouncing against every boundary possible. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Obviously, that looks different for different people. If that is like very kind of a combative stance, that's where I think we try somewhat to say, okay, I'm going to hold this boundary, but also we're going to shift from like we're like fighting against each other to my goal being, okay, look, we both want the same thing, which is for you to have a life you enjoy and to grow and to have independence and to learn how to function, right? Like we want those same things. So can we, again, kind of collaboratively, I know that's way easier said than done. But like, are there creative ways that we could work together to figure out what that looks like, instead of kind of like lay down the law, like, because I said so. That doesn't mean, so, but really go back, you can watch last week.
I feel like what you were about to say was sometimes it's just because I said so. And if that's a, you know, something that you have said before, that's okay, you know. But just real quick, Robert, can you actually give like a very short synopsis of what you mean by bouncing boundaries, like kind of ping-ponging off of boundaries?
Totally. Yeah. So adolescence as a developmental stage, right? Like kind of teenage, early 20s, right? Like your goal, the goal of that developmental stage is like for me to detach from family system and become my own independent person, right? So if you picture like boundaries, right? Like they are supposed to be pushing against boundaries at any given point because they're trying to figure out where those are, how far can I push things, right? Like that's what they're supposed to be doing in terms of I'm now going to leave and then go do my own thing. So like trying to figure out where those boundaries are. So that's normal, right? So just to throw that out there, that's normal. Same as roughly equivalent to a toddler, right? I have a 3-year-old. He pushes every boundary possible ever. That's very frustrating to me. That also is what he's supposed to be doing because he is figuring out that he like literally is his own person as opposed to like a part of mom and dad, right? So it's a little bit different, but like that's how you figure out how to function as your own self is by bouncing off of all those boundaries. Like so that's normal. Just to normalize that, that's not just your child.
Very good. Guys, I wish this conversation could last another 2 or 3 hours roughly, because it's just such a good conversation. And there are even avenues that we haven't even walked down that are so important. And if we could have another one of these classes and go down some of those other little avenues, we would totally do that. It is 7:34. We wrap up at 7:30. So we made it. But are there any last thoughts or questions before we go for the evening? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment. I'm a parent of a 15-year-old and, well, almost 16 and almost 15-year-old. And I don't struggle as much with my boundaries as a parent. I mean, I know I can always work on those areas. I'm more concerned with the boundaries of other children. When you come to these subjects of social media and the phones. They can't unsee things. They can't change the way that they view themselves as a result of being on Instagram or some of these other things. So those are the issues that I deal with as a parent when it comes to these social media, the phones and everything, because when we grew up, there was no problem using the landline to call somebody and talk to somebody. But texting, there are texts that come through that those children would never say on the telephone, but they feel free to do it in a text. And that leaves the receiver in a different position to interpret feelings and all of that. And they just spend so much time rereading texts and, oh, what do I do? And I'll scroll back up here and reread the conversation. And I think that it's destroying this brain that our children have with so much stimulation. And I just wanted to share because with kids that are in high school, the teasing and all that, like we talked about tonight, I have rules. And it's not because I want to keep them in a box or I want to fight with them, or have them look strange to their friends. It's because I want them to live a long and healthy life. I want them to view themselves as valuable people that have a purpose on this earth and not to be interpreted based on someone else and their comments, their texts, their social media posts, their bullying, all of those kinds of things. So I just wanted to share my thoughts. I'm sorry I went over.
Don't be sorry. Yeah, I'm sure you said, a lot that a lot of us were thinking. Any thoughts in response to that from any of you?
Yeah, I think every question everyone has posed and the comments, I've just felt like a pause of, wow, what do you even say to that? Because it's so much bigger, it's so much more personal. It's easy to just say, throw out ideas, but just want to acknowledge like this is really hard. And there is a such thing as a disinhibition effect that happens with technology. We are disinhibited to when we're on there. We say things we wouldn't say. And I think it is tricky, and just as much as it's helpful to remind people of that and teach them that, and speak with kids and teens, and helping them learn to talk to people in person, and because it is a real thing. And that's not necessarily, I don't really have anything advicey other than, yeah, that is hard. Thank you for sharing that. And it's why we're here, because we're all like, what do we do with this? Because it isn't easy. There is not a textbook. And we do care, and we want to shepherd these hearts and minds really well. And it doesn't mean they're always understanding the boundaries or wanting them. And that makes it even trickier.
Thank you.
My last little thought to that, and I love that, Sylvia, where you came from, was really just to validate, yeah, heck yeah, we even got an amen, sister, in the comments. Like, yeah, I think you said it right on. What came to my mind really was two things. Next week, our class is on healthy sexuality and easy access pornography, where we kind of talk about exactly that. Pornography is easily accessible now. It's not something that you have to go into a dark store to get, and no one's going to let you in because it's 1975 or whatever. It's anywhere, at any time, absolutely anywhere, completely easily accessible. And what do we do with that? A lot of it has to do with kind of what we do after they've run into it, unfortunately. What do we do after they've run into it? So I think Haley is your name, Hallie?
Hallie.
Yes. I think everything that you said is exactly the right thing to do, which is to make sure that they know that they have, that you want a long and healthy life for them, that they have purpose and value. And everything that you said, just kind of pouring into them over and over and over again, that it's not about this, it's about this. And there's no easy way to do that. There's no easy answer for that, but validating for them how hard this is, and also how much of life this is, and that they are worth so much more than the things that they might be seeing, from time to time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. Thanks for being willing to ask that hard question. Well, for all of you, I hope you do come back. And I know some of you are going to request the recording. So when you're listening to this on the recording, even though you weren't in our class, please come back next Tuesday at 6:30. We're going to talk about sex and porn. It's everyone's favorite. So looking forward to seeing you guys there. And that's it for tonight. Thanks so much for being with us, both counselors and our participants. And we'll see you next week. I love when I get the little emojis. Thanks, Leon. All right, guys. Thank you so much.
That was hard.
That last one?
That was good. It just, it's important. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your time.
Hard in a good way. Like, we're doing good. Everyone's on this journey.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks so much for that last response, Sylvia. That was really good. Yeah, this is hard. Sometimes that's
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll see y'all next week. Bye.
Bye, guys.